In Europe, well, we have now the EU electronic evidence package, which is already,
Hmm.
it was published in August of 2023 and it will be enforced in 2026 next year. And essentially, this
Uh-huh.
package, which consists of a regulation and a directive, will allow law
Hmm.
enforcement authorities to have access to electronic evidence, especially traffic data and content data hosted by an
Hmm.
internet service provider, even when the service provider is not specifically located in the European Union.
Welcome to Secure and Simple podcast. In this podcast, we demystify cybersecurity governance, compliance with various standards and regulations, and other topics that are of interest for consultants, CISOs, and other cybersecurity professionals. Hello, I'm Dejan Kosutic, and I'm the host of Secure and Simple podcast. Today we have a very interesting guest. His name is Cristos Velasco, and he's an independent consultant and associate professor in the fields of cyber law, cybercrime, cybersecurity, data privacy, artificial intelligence, and is the author of 5 books on all of these topics. And he has, amongst others, very interesting clients like United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, Interpol, Council of Europe, OECD. So in today's podcast, you'll learn more about this legal aspect of cybersecurity and in particular best practices on how to preserve electronic evidence. Welcome to the show, Christos.
Thank you, Dayan. Thanks for hosting me in your show.
So, how did you actually become a consultant? What triggered you really to go in
Well,
this direction?
it has been quite a long path. I started off doing consultancy mostly for a boutique firm in Mexico City, specializing in information technology and information and trade law.
Hmm.
And then through that path, it actually led me to just go into different directions, exploring different areas of cyber law, cyberspace regulation,
Hmm.
including data privacy, cybersecurity, and much more. Well, much more specifically focused on cybercrime and electronic evidence. So this has been quite a
Hmm.
long field, and since then I've been focused for the last 20 years in this specific area. Mostly cybercrime, AI, and preservation of electronic evidence, as it relates and the
Hmm.
needs that are actually needed for criminal justice authorities and law enforcement authorities responsible for these tasks.
Hmm. Okay, and how come you didn't really go fully into the, let's say, academic world, or let's say fully to working for a government agency? I mean, why working as, let's say, independent consultant, where I mean there is no guarantee, right, that you will have enough work to do. So why going into this
Well, this
direction
is, I think,
as a
I find
consultant?
it like a very interesting mix. Ever since I left Mexico, I was very
Hmm.
much involved in the academic field. So this is an area I could actually not live without. And I'm still doing it today. And
Hmm.
I work as an associate professor at the DHBB in Mannheim and
Uh-huh.
Stuttgart. And to be honest, like just teaching and being with the students and, be part of the academic world, it's also very satisfying and fulfilling for me.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay, good. So let's speak a little bit about this world of electronic evidence. So, in short, very short, a couple of short sentences, how would you summarize what really electronic evidence is, and why is this really important for
Yes,
cybersecurity?
excellent. Well, as it is the case in most definitions from coming from cybersecurity and cybercrime, there's no other standard, quite a definition of electronic evidence. But it's
Hmm.
actually means the way that law enforcement authorities might actually seek and grasp the collection of evidence that might be useful for a criminal investigation. We have to remember
Okay.
today, Dayan, that most of the evidence that law enforcement authorities need are contained in digital devices. Everything that has to do
Hmm.
with our laptops, our smartphones, and everything that is actually kept and preserved in a store and stored by service providers, no telecommunication service providers. And well, and this is a fact. I mean, we're based in Europe, and well, the European Commission has mentioned, and there's a statistic out there that mentions that almost 60, more than 60% of the electronic evidence that is stored and that is needed by these criminal justice authorities is kept in the hands of global service providers. So that's why it's so useful today, to have, that evidence that is actually divided into three different categories. It could be subscriber information, traffic data, and content data.
And you mentioned these global service providers. So you mean companies like Google, Microsoft, or some
Yes,
other
well, I mean,
companies?
global service providers, all like most of that we know them, the top five, like, Microsoft, Amazon, Meta, Twitter, and well, and all these
Yep.
different, sub companies that are part of those companies, like WhatsApp. And we have to remember today that now we have crypto. And much of the evidence that is
Block.
also actually going through and that is actually in the needs for law enforcement authorities is in the possession of, crypto exchangers. So that's another area that is actually growing, and it's actually
Yeah.
having a lot of relevance today, and it's becoming much more complex because, if we talked about like the preservation of the blockchain and the evidence, well, we can go into more technical details, but it's also part of the evidence that is needed for a criminal investigation.
So without diving into, let's say, into depth of technology, is really this blockchain technology a good, let's say, way to preserve evidence?
I think, well, technically speaking, yes, it's a good way to preserve it. To have a grasp of that evidence, that's where the challenge is actually happening these days. Many of the law enforcement authorities today are actually trying to get, sufficient training, sufficient cooperation from all these different blockchain intelligence companies so that they could actually provide some help and guidance to make them preserve and have access to that evidence. No? This is challenging. It's not a new area. It's an emerging area, but it's highly needed. And we are in highly need of experts and expertise from not only from the government, but also for the private sector that could actually lead and could help and support law enforcement authorities to make a better use of the preservation of this type of evidence.
So if I understood well, one of the biggest problems that, let's say, this part of industry is facing is lack of experts, lack of knowledge.
Well, you could say one part is that. The second, I mean, this is an ongoing field. It's growing and it's growing, and there's some techniques, especially in crypto, which is becoming very specialized and highly technically, specialized. I mean, it's really hard to catch up with the new and latest developments. Perhaps what like law enforcement authorities learned like 3 or 6 months ago, it's not longer useful. No, and
It's
it's
changing
changing.
fast,
It's
right?
an evolving field. However, it's also important, that these law enforcement authorities and experts, specifically experts that have an interest in this field, that they keep at least, the basic ideas on how to keep track of, of this evidence that is going through the different blockchains.
Uh-huh. And this what is changing. Okay, I understand that technology is changing on one hand, but is it also changing? I mean, this need for change also comes from the changing legislation, or so why are the things so
Well,
quickly
that's an
changing there?
interesting question, and this is an area that I am actually I would like to go a little bit further. I'm a lawyer specializing in this field. Legislation, I mean, well, in Europe, well, we have now the EU electronic evidence package, which is already it was published in August of 2023, and it will be enforced in 2026 next year. Essentially, this package, which consists of a regulation and a directive, will allow law
Hmm.
enforcement authorities to have access to electronic evidence, especially traffic data and content data hosted by an
Hmm.
internet service provider, even when the service provider is not specifically located in the European Union. So, in that sense, well, this regulation provides specific rules, timeframes, and ways to preserve that evidence directly, or to preserve, or to request this evidence directly from service providers located in different jurisdictions. So that's one
Hmm.
part. That's one European legislation, but we have to remember that this is an international topic. And on this area,
Hmm.
well, there's already a binding treaty that provides some basic and essential rules on the preservation of electronic evidence, which is the Budapest Cybercrime Convention. And most
Hmm.
recently, the second additional protocol, which is still pending to be enforced. It still requires the ratification of five member states to enter into force. But essentially, this new second additional protocol will provide like more global and specific rules for member states that are part of the Budapest Convention to request, the preservation of electronic evidence from global service providers, as well as,
Hmm.
domain name registers. No, so this is
Hmm.
one instrument. There's another upcoming instrument, which is the UN the UN Convention on Cybercrime, which is also
Hmm.
contains specific rules on the preservation of electronic evidence, preservation of electronic evidence in real time, and also international cooperation measures, which also very much combine all these different rules on the preservation of electronic evidence when one country needs that evidence that is stored in a jurisdiction outside of its reach, no? So as to say.
Yeah.
So this is in a nutshell. I mean, these three main upcoming instruments, no, that will be shortly
Yeah.
coming to force and that will uh, provide the specific rules for the preservation of electronic evidence.
So very dynamic. So, on this EU package, how can or what companies actually have to do to prepare for this EU package? That is, you mentioned 2026, if I understood
Yes,
well.
it will enter into force in August of 2026. Well, usually, as you know,
Hmm.
most of these regulations and directives usually give like a time frame so that the member states could
Hmm.
actually have enough time to transpose it or to implement it, no, at the
Hmm.
national level. So essentially, August
Yeah.
20,
Yeah.
2006 will be the deadline. So in that sense, what now? Well, some experts need to be prepared for, especially law enforcement authorities. This will be a game changer in a way that now, law enforcement authorities could request the preservation of electronic data, specifically subscriber information and
Uh-huh.
traffic data within 10 days, no, from the service
Hmm.
provider. We have to remember that before, with the current rules, usually the time frame under the European investigation order, there was a deadline of 120 days, which was sort of like,
Okay.
the general time frame. But this is just talking about the countries that are part of the European Union.
Hmm.
But think about like a country where the evidence or the service provider might reside. Think about US, perhaps Brazil, or any other country outside of the EU. Well, that will take much longer. And in that sense, well, the common instrument that is actually used by these law enforcement authorities is the mutual legal assistance request, which is,
Hmm.
well, it's an old instrument. It's still legally binding, but it takes in general, at least in Europe, 10 months to get the
Okay.
preservation of this evidence because it has to go through different channels, no? From the Criminal Justice Authority to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and goes on and goes on, no? So now with this new regulation, we will have an improvement in a way that the timeframes will be shortened.
Much shorter. Okay, so how companies need to prepare for these short time frames and for these new
Well,
requirements?
perhaps this is just if you are an advisor, specifically of internet service providers. Well, you have to think that if this is an internet service provider that does not specifically reside in Europe, well, you have to think that they will have to come up with some requirements, like having and appoint a legal representative. If that service provider is not specifically located in Europe, they need to appoint a legal representative. Also, another important thing that they need to do is that if they don't have, an office or a presence in the European Union, they might probably have to appoint that. I mean, there's the possibility under the directive to appoint a legal representative, or
Yeah.
a subsidiary or an office, no, according to whatever needs.
Yeah.
But the thing here
So
is
it's similar
that
to GDPR. Sorry.
we had these problems before, especially with global service providers, that they don't want to be, governed by the rules, even though they were actually targeting European consumers. And that is
Yeah.
changing. And this is now not an excuse. They will have to appoint a legal representative or a legal office.
Understood. Okay, so if I understood well, this is similar to GDPR, because in GDPR also there are requirements to nominate, to appoint this legal representative that is within the EU, right? Okay, but what about the companies that are based in Europe? So what will change for them? What are the biggest changes they will have to do because of this EU package?
If it does essentially, they will have to comply with all these rules, with the different timeframes, with the different appointments, and also what's interesting, Dejan, is like under this new EU package, now there will be a new database that will be created by by the European Commission with the support of the European member states, where and through this tool, they will be able to actually exchange information on a confidential basis. And this is very relevant because before we didn't have that. I mean, we had like some spread databases out there, but they were not like really well coordinated or harmonized. And that's another thing, some member states will have to prepare on how to, provide specific, interaction and harmonization on how to, comply with the use of this database that is going to be used to preserve this evidence.
Yeah. And from your experience, are most of the companies already compliant and they just have to add a little bit more because of this new EU package? Or are most companies very much not prepared and they will have to do most of the things from the very beginning?
Well, that's an excellent question, Dejan. And actually, if you read the Series 2000 report from Eurojust, there's an interesting finding there that it mentioned that only 4% of companies dealing with, provision of services, hosting services, are sufficiently compliant with the upcoming rules of the EU.
Wow.
So that perhaps will give you sort of like, an example of how important now is to take, seriously this legislation.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah, definitely, especially for aspiring consultants who would like to go into this area. Okay, now let's switch back to this electronic evidence. There is also this concept of digital forensics. So how would you actually explain the difference between electronic or preservation of electronic evidence and the digital forensics?
Well, essentially, digital forensics is more like this area that goes into, researching actually engage so that law enforcement authorities could have access to specific information that is contained in a computer system, in a digital device. And this is usually assisted through the use of, technologies that are normally licensed by major digital forensic companies. So that's in a nutshell what digital forensics is. Well, digital forensics also involves different steps, which includes first of all, the initiation, the preservation, and the presentation of that evidence so that it could be actually legally binding in a court of law. And this is an area that is also very interesting, specifically for police and public prosecutors that want to have access or want to seize evidence or equipment as part of, a criminal investigation. We have to think that when they search, a premise, an office or a house, they come across a number of physical devices, laptops, computers, memories, RAM memories, whatever you call it. And those devices are very relevant because this is where many or most of the devices are needed to preserve things that criminal justice authorities need to prove that a crime was committed. Whereas when we talked about preservation of electronic evidence, it's essentially a provisional measure that a law enforcement authority, whether it's an investigative judge, a public prosecutor, requests to a telecommunications service provider, a global service provider, essentially to freeze the information that they have in their servers. So by the time that they get, a search warrant, this evidence is preserved and won't disappear or won't fade away immediately, because that's, one of the things that happens. This digital evidence is so volatile. It could disappear within a matter of minutes, hours. So that's why it's so important, this preservation things that are actually regulated in the Budapest Cybercrime Convention, in the upcoming UN Convention on Cybercrime and the EU package. So essentially, those are the main differences between digital forensics and preservation of evidence.
So, and from the company point of view, is this preservation of electronic evidence only important because of this legal side, or is there any other aspects that are, let's say, important for companies?
Well, there's this is an interesting thing, because if you take a look at the big picture, we are going through some complexities, specifically here in Europe. We have also legislation on not only on preservation of electronic evidence, but also legislation on data retention. And we have to remember, Dejan, that there was a judgment from the European Court of the Court of Justice of the European Union that actually ruled that this, that data retention directive was considered to be go beyond further the fundamental rights, and it was actually invalidated. So in theory, this data retention directive should not longer be applicable across the EU. However, there are some countries that are still applying it, like for instance Spain. And there are some other countries that, struck down or took into consideration this resolution from the Court of Justice of the EU. But in practice, they're still using it. And there's also some inconsistencies on the terminology of what might be understood as data retention and data preservation, Dejan. And this is something that I have also noticed when I go to all these different forums, these seminars, that there's this, no, I mean, there's no clear, there's not a clear distinction between both, between those two concepts, no?
Okay. Now, when it comes to preservation of electronic evidence, is it enough to use some kind of a tool within the company just to resolve this, or is this something much more than using certain technical tools?
Well, it's actually, well, if we're talking about preservation of electronic evidence, it's essentially about like making use of, well, if it's a law enforcement authority, they will have to go through the right channels, either through the website of the company so that they could actually, if it's Meta, if it's Microsoft, they have their own websites where they actually require the law enforcement authorities to fill up like, different formulars and fulfill different requirements so that they could go on and say, well, yes, we are in a position to preserve that evidence. But sometimes many of those websites or the information that is not provided is not sufficiently enough for the service provider. And this is another area, Andrea, that some law enforcement authorities and criminal justice authorities are facing. They're facing some troubles on the way that they believe that they have fulfilled all the information so that this evidence could be, preserved. But some of those companies still deny or might deny on specific, things that they did not fulfill. And especially if it's an American service provider, they will have to prove a number of things so that the service provider have to or preserve that evidence. And that will include whether this is an emergency situation. And also under the American system, they will have to provide, this digital evidence, that it's actually sufficiently needed so that it could be preserved. No, so the standards of of preserving the evidence actually varied between Europe and U.S. And this is also some complexities that, for instance, consultants should take into consideration, no? Whenever they are advising service providers or law enforcement or criminal justice authorities. No?
Okay, and on the company side, if the company does receive this, let's say, order to or request to preserve electronic evidence, is it enough to simply use some kind of technology to do it, or is there more to it? Is there some kind of organizational process that is needed for this to happen?
Well, I mean, when it comes to the technology, I mean, the essentially I have already make this distinction about the different types of data, no? Subscriber data, traffic data, content data. And the more sensitive the data is, the more requirements are needed. And they will have to actually go through all these different, mutual legal assistance procedures. If it's, content data, specific information about like, photographs, videos, no? But also traffic data. Some countries still require, this, that this actually that is approved by either a judge, an investigative judge, or at least, a public prosecutor. So essentially, it varies from, country to country and jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and the trick here is, you have to be aware of all these different laws and regulations, that regulate all the preservation of electronic evidence.
And okay, from a technical point of view, probably it's important to preserve metadata, timestamps, digital signatures, these kind of things. Is there anything else from a technical point which that usually needs to be preserved?
Well, it's another thing that might sound so simple is, for instance, IP addresses.
Uh-huh.
We have to remember that most of those IP addresses are very useful and very practical for law enforcement authorities to know the whereabouts the whereabouts of a suspect, a criminal, and based on that, this information is also very useful. So that's one thing. IP addresses, but also, well, you mentioned clearly timestamps. Timestamps is also another area or another information that might actually be needed. So yeah, I mean, it's just depending, but you have to be very aware on the sensitiveness of the data. Because as I mentioned before, the more sensitive the data, the more requirements are needed for criminal justice authorities to have a grasp or to request and freeze the preservation of that evidence.
And are there some special rules on how these preserved evidence needs to be protected? So are there some special cybersecurity controls that need to be applied to this preserved
Well,
data?
not necessarily. I mean, because well, if I mean you think about like this data is mostly in the hands of private sector. So depending on the way that it's actually fulfilled, requested, and whether it's an emergency situation is actually also defined in the new upcoming package of the EU electronic package and also the second additional protocol. An emergency situation might be a situation where the imminent life of a person, of an individual, is in danger. No? Think of an example. If this is a situation of someone who might be in danger of being kidnapped, or someone who's in danger of being abused, sexually abused by a pedophile, this might actually be considered an emergency situation. And in that case, and especially under specific rules, especially the second additional protocol, the EU package, there are some exceptions as to how these might be preserved. It could be actually directly requested to the service provider, and the service provider might have to actually provide that information. But obviously, the standard of proof, they will have to prove that this is an emergency.
Okay, okay. And there is also this concept of chain of custody. So, how is this really related to this preservation?
Oh, well,
of
that's
evidence?
an interesting question. Well, the change of custody is essentially this legal procedure that provides all the different steps on how any type of evidence, and not even digital evidence or electronic, should be preserved. And this is, for instance, is very mostly used in different crime areas. The chain of custody. But well, there's also a chain of custody in the electronic world, and that will have to fulfill all these different steps that law enforcement will have to, follow, and then will have to present that, in a court of law to be sufficiently admissible, so as to prove that this evidence was legally obtained and collected and without infringing any individual rights, no, for instance.
And this, let's say, evidence needs to be presented from the company itself, or from the legal, or from, let's say, the government, or any other agency that is
It's
presenting this in
usually
the court.
mostly government agencies, government-related
Okay, okay.
agencies, the ones that actually should comply with this change of custody. However, this is also an area that is very important for consultants and private companies, because if that part of that evidence was not well or sufficiently preserved following all these different criteria and steps, this might be considered non-binding or could be considered not legal. And here is, for instance, where some consultants might actually have an interest in making sure that that evidence that was presented by a police or a public prosecutor sufficiently fulfill all these different steps to be considered legal.
And could this also be, let's say, this preservation of evidence, could it also be helpful for companies not only in cases when the government actually asks them to present this evidence, but also when they actually pursue some lawsuit towards a third party where they, I don't know, ask for some, where they basically litigate and ask for some damage to be repaid. So is this also a kind of a use case where this electronic evidence is
Oh
important?
yeah, this is an interesting question because this is an area that very much intersect not only with criminal law but civil law or liability law. No? So, for instance, if someone is searching or trying to prove a case of defamation, they will have to actually also make use of this, change of custody to prove all these different steps on how that evidence was actually shown, proved, and presented in a court of law. So yeah, definitely, it's also an area that intersects with other different areas of law, no, including civil
Okay.
law, administrative law.
So if I understood well, basically the companies will have to comply with these rules on preserving digital evidence because of the government requests. But there is also one beneficial outcome of this, and this is that they will be able to prepare this evidence if they actually have to sue someone else on in this, let's say, civil law, according to civil law, right?
Yes, yes, and this is also another complex area in a way that when this evidence or this change of evidence is actually presented in an area different to criminal law, then there's some criteria, and the criteria to be this or to admit this type of evidence in a court of law, whether it's civil, family, or even administrative law, vary from country to country. I mean, there's no silver bullet, no, and this is
Yeah.
also quite challenging.
Yeah. And by the way, how do companies handle this complexity from the legal point of view? I mean, there is, you mentioned at the beginning these three, let's say, types of legislation that are becoming relevant in this area. Yeah, especially out of Europe, there are many other legislations that are probably different. So, how does an international company that is present in many countries, how do they manage this kind of extreme complexity?
Well, first of all, if you are not an expert on a field, you have to refer to, consult an expert who actually provides sufficient, findings on the special needs that the companies needed. Because we have to remember that we are not experts in all different areas. No? So that's one
Yeah.
step, to get like legal counsel. Also, the other thing, if this is something to do with compliance, because think about like, for instance, this digital evidence package might also have some interaction with the Digital Services Act, which is this new legislation that actually imposes a number of obligations for telecommunication companies, service providers, search engines, etc., to actually make sure that the traffic that is going through the networks is not illegal. And they will have to actually report it if they found, illegal situations or traffic coming from a specific, website, domain name, or even IP address. They will have to report to the law enforcement authorities. And although this Digital Services Act does not specifically go into detail on how to preserve evidence, it's very much well connected to this EU service package in a way that that will have to, coexist with those specific rules and the rules that are contained in the Digital Services Act.
Okay, good. Let's discuss a little bit about your business. So, if I understood well, you are consulting companies around these, let's say, preservation of digital, the electronic evidence, but also some other things. So, is your primary business really in consulting or training? Where do you see the biggest, let's say, market opportunity
Well,
there?
it's actually both, Ian. I mean, part of what I do, part of the core of activities that I do is actually to make sure or to advise countries on how to implement international legal frameworks, for instance, in cybercrime, electronic evidence, and much more recently on artificial intelligence and data privacy.
Mm-hmm.
But also, part of these rules have like this level of complexity that they do require a specific tailored training to not
Mm-hmm.
only the law enforcement authorities, but also, to companies and staff of those companies, also to help them and to guide them to make them or to help them comply with the complexities and the practicalities on how like these rules are enforced in each country.
Mm-hmm. So it's very similar, I would say, to other, let's say, consultants that I speak to. They usually do provide this consulting, but also training service, which is usually comes hand in hand, and which is usually a best combination of both of these things. And yeah, so if I may ask, how do you get such big and good clients? I mean, having OECD or Council of Europe as a client. I mean, how do you get these clients?
Well,
It's
it's essentially, it's a difficult question, but it has just gone through the time. Part of like the commitment of a consultant and also of an academic is to keep yourself very much in shape. Publishing,
mm-hmm.
getting in touch with the real network, be there,
Mm-hmm.
try to grow your network and also explore further consulting opportunities and just keep going and going, and also, well, because also a part of the consultancy is you learn a lot from the things that you do in specific projects. But these projects also,
Mm-hmm.
have a specific time limit and you have to focus on other things, no? And part of that is also, well, to keep abreast on the new upcoming, threats, tendencies, and in specific in my area, the upcoming regulations, which are quite a
Mm-hmm.
lot, quite a lot of regulations that many experts and companies and law enforcement authorities have to catch up. And this is not an easy task.
Mm-hmm.
And this is an area
Mm-hmm.
where I try to actually fulfill, well, an existing gap. No?
Mm-hmm. And does your academic career help you with this catching up and being actually in front of maybe other competitors in this
Oh,
business?
yes, definitely. It's compatible in a way that, well, it
Mm-hmm.
helps me, well, to stay not only connected, but also because part of, like this academic world, you have to catch up with all these different
Mm-hmm.
laws, regulations, and the way that are implemented on a practical level. And if you miss a
Mm-hmm.
bit of part of that, you are gone, man. So
Yeah.
it's part of the deal, no? Of being there, no? So
Yeah, so it's a good kind of mixture between and actually supports your main income business,
right.
right? I mean, this academic one supports the business. Okay, great. So, if just for the end, the last question, if you could, let's say, suggest to potential consultants who would go into this area, so what would you suggest? What are the most important things to keep in mind?
Well, first of all, you know your audience, know your public, and specifically, is this a specific client that has specific needs? Well, just try to
Mm-hmm.
be very proactive in the way that you provide all these consulting services and the specific needs that they might have, no? And also, well, uh, and this is complex in a way that, well, we know that in some companies there are, like in any other area, there are, bureaucracies, there are,
Mm-hmm.
people that have to take the decisions in order to, to go ahead with a project with a specific aspect of what they might need. But my advice is be there, try to be persistent, and try to convince all these decision makers, whether it's a decision maker or a director or a specific high level staff member of an international organization or regional organization who's responsible for implementing specific projects or taking specific decisions, no, that might be in their own in their best interest.
Yeah, great. Okay, so I think this sums up very nicely on the most important topics that we discussed today. So thank you for these insights, Cristos. It's been a pleasure talking
Thanks
to you.
to you, Dejan. My pleasure.
Great. It was great having you today. So thanks everyone for listening or watching this podcast, and see you again in 2 weeks' time in our new episode of Secure and Simple podcast. Thanks for making it this far in today's episode of Secure and Simple podcast. Here's some useful info for consultants and other professionals who do cybersecurity governance and compliance for a living. On Advisora website, you can check out various tools that can help your business. For example, Conformia software enables you to streamline and scale ISO 27001 implementation and maintenance for your clients. White label documentation toolkits for NIS2, DORA, ISO 27001 and other ISO standards enable you to create all the required documents for your clients. Accredited lead auditor and lead implementer courses for various standards and frameworks enable you to show your expertise to potential clients. And a learning management system called Company Training Academy with numerous videos for NIS2, DORA, ISO 27001 and other frameworks enable you to organize training and awareness programs for your clients' workforce. Check out the links in the description below for more information. If you like this podcast, please give it a thumbs up. It helps us with better ranking, and I would also appreciate if you share it with your colleagues. That's it for today. Stay safe.